A card game of choices and consequences, where your skill, not luck, is your greatest weapon. Today we talk about GWENT, the Witcher card game. Hello everyone, welcome to episode number 12 of Dude, Where's My Card podcast, where we primarily evaluate strategy card games from both a game designer's and regular gamer's perspective. As always, my name is Brendan, and I am joined by my co-host Jordan.
Hey guys.
In today's episode, we'll be talking about GWENT, the Witcher card game by
CD Projekt Red.
CD Projekt Red. I was going to say Project Red, that's CD Projekt Red.
Yeah. So just a quick little info about it before we dive into it too much. So GWENT is a free-to-play digital collectible card game developed by CD Projekt Red. I think it was released in 2018 for console versions for the PlayStation and Xbox, and then later got a full update in 2019 for iOS and PC, and that is the most updated systems, is the Android and PC and Apple versions. So what GWENT is a turn-based card game between two players, with each game taking between 3 rounds. Each player must play 1 card each turn from a deck of at least 25 cards. Each deck belongs to a faction that offers different playstyles. There are 5 different factions within the game. Each faction has different leaders who each have individual abilities. GWENT does not use a mana system like most traditional CCGs, which means that card advantage is often what wins you the game. So it's a pretty straightforward game because you just play things, and you're trying to get the highest total because each card gives you a score, and at the end of a round, whoever has the most score wins that round. First to 2 wins.
Yeah, so even breaking down further of what the game is, essentially it's 2 players that have 2 rows in front of them to play cards. Every time they play a card, they get a point total cumulative to their side of the field, as well as usually an effect that either affects their points or their cards in the field, or their opponent's points or their opponent's cards in the field. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of becomes a game of chicken of you're trying to power up points, and at what point do you stop getting points for your side of the field and force your opponent to either choose to beat you or to pass the round.
Yeah.
And there are 3 rounds. First one to win 2 wins the overall round.
There's the melee lane and then a ranged lane is how they describe it. And sometimes cards have effects only when they're placed in one of those 2 lanes.
Yes.
And typically an effect, so if you play something in a melee, it only usually affects your opponent's cards in the melee.
Yeah.
And similar, if you play something in ranged, you only affect cards in their opponent's ranged. That's pretty straightforward for that part, but the key factor of what card advantage they talk about, so there's no draw in this game until the beginning of a new round.
Yeah.
And then that draw is set. I think it's 4 or 5 cards you draw?
3 cards.
3 cards?
You get 3 cards after every round and a chance to mulligan 2. Where at the beginning you get your 10 cards and you get a chance to mulligan 3 right away.
So you get right off the hop, you get those 10 cards like Brendan said, and then you each play back and forth. At any point in time, you can choose to pass your turn. However, that is you saying that you are done for that round. So if you pass at, say, 15 points and your opponent has 3, your opponent now has the choice to continue playing cards to try to beat your 15 or pass so that they have more cards going into another round. Mm-hmm. So that's where the card advantage point comes from, because like we said, you only get to draw a set amount of cards at the start of every round. So if you blow your entire hand at that first round, you only have 3 cards for the remaining round.
Yep.
Which leads to some pretty interesting gameplay. There's some cool mechanics that go on throughout it, but that is the core of it. The game is still continually being updated, as Brendan had mentioned before to me, on the PC and mobile versions. Yeah. But this is also cross-play, so it still plays between the 2 of those.
Yes, the gameplay is identical between the 2. A lot of people are actually saying it's faster on the mobile than on the PC because it's optimized.
Interesting. So it is also based off of the original aspect of the Witcher 3 card game, GWENT. Yeah. However, as many of you who might have played the original Witcher, it had 3 lanes, but a lot of the mechanics still play the same.
Yeah.
It's just this now simplified slightly to 2 lanes, but there's still triggers that happen. That's the quick breakdown of what the game is and how to play. First off, thoughts, Brennan, what do you want to take on this? You want to go from a gamer's perspective or the designer here?
Well, I'd like to... Well, we can talk about both.
Yeah.
Because both of us have different experiences with the game. A lot of my experience with GWENT came before the change in 2018 that changed it to 2-lane. I played a lot of 3-lane. And at that point, equivalent to now, I would have made it to rank 2, fringe rank 1. So rank 0 is where the pro players are at. So I actually grind really far into this game. So I have a very good foundation of knowledge of this style of game.
Mm-hmm.
And this game for me was really cool because it was really the first kind of CCG-esque game where, first of all, there wasn't true combat. And second of all, your condition to win was related about you gaining points, not stopping your opponent to getting points or knocking down your opponent's HP to 0. Like, it was all about controlling me and what I can do, as well as managing my hand properly to try and gain an advantage there. So I really enjoyed being able to do that, and the value of playing a game where you get to focus on just you. And, well, I mean, it's not just you. There's lots of take that in the game. Like, there's lots of ways to interfere with your opponent. But when it comes down to it, you're very rarely removing cards that your opponent plays from the field. It's your cards versus their cards. And that's great to me.
From my perspective, it's interesting, and like it was a different style of play, but several times I have tried to pick this game up and play it more, and I think the lack of direct combat is not as interesting to me. And I've really tried to give it a couple true goes at it. From my perspective, it's not that there wasn't enough in there, because there's so much options and so many different gameplays. I felt a lot of times like I was just playing an AI system, because there wasn't like a direct combat, or it didn't feel like there was mistakes that were always made. Maybe I'm just playing against people who were the same skill
that's part
levels.
of the problem. Like, when you get up to more skilled opponents, the tactical level of this game to me is just like absolutely through the roof, because every time you play a card, you have to question, am I playing the right card in this situation to get a response out of my opponent?
Yeah.
Because card advantage is everything. If you can go into the second round with a 2-card or more advantage, you usually won rounds 2 and round 3. Especially if you played your cards right, so that you can stack your hand for round 2 and really just force your opponent off it. Because in high play, most games actually go to round 1, you kind of duke it out till you get till about 5 cards in your hand. Both of you kind of evaluate whether or not you're going to win the round. One person gains a card advantage, you go to the second round. And the player almost immediately will forfeit the second round, so everyone goes into the third round with 9 and 8 cards instead of 5 and 6 cards, because a 1-card variance at 9 and 8 doesn't mean as much when you have less cards and there's a 1-card variance. Like, that's, if you have 4 cards and your opponent has 1 more card, then it's a 20% variance. But if it's at 10 cards, it's only a 10% variance. So it's easier to play that third round in an all-for-nothing game like that. But sometimes you just get stomped in both rounds. It's just the way it goes.
Yeah. So, I mean, my initial take of the game was not as... I also didn't really dive it that much into the Witcher's version originally. Like, when I played the Witcher game, the game itself was so overwhelming with the amount of things that I could do that GWENT...
Side tangent. Great game.
Oh, yeah. Very good game, and there's just a lot to do. But the fact that they had a card game within that game that was its own standalone game, and it was true because it got ported as a standalone game.
It's just kind of funny. So you look at that, like, it makes me think of Tetra Masters from Final Fantasy 9, I think. It might have been an 8 and 9, actually. Or a version of it.
9's the one I remember.
Yes, but 9's the one that most people remember, where it's a good standalone functional game. Well, Final Fantasy 9 people will argue that that wasn't a great functional game. There was lots of issues with it. But that's that same concept of having a game within a game that people actually enjoyed. And this one got to the point where people just said, we need a real port of this, and they made a real port of it.
Yeah, and because of that, because it was within such a massive game, that it really just took a backlog for me, because it was hard enough for me to focus what was going on in the main story or the main game, that I never played it as much. I did enjoy the intros that you played, but it just seemed like it had so much to do that I didn't
It was a side quest in the game that actually needed so much involvement because there's so much to it already. And you're just like, well, I got enough on my plate. I'm just going to put this to the side for now.
And then when I got back into the 2018 version, we'll call the Witcher card game, the GWENT mobile version, I played it, and I was almost disappointed that it wasn't still the original game, because now I was done with The Witcher, done with everything, and I'm now ready to dive into GWENT. And I dive into it, and it's a simplified, more two-lane version.
Yeah, and after playing the 2-lane version, it doesn't really change much from the game.
Yeah.
The third lane just added an added line of complexity, but less interaction with your opponent because of it. Like, by simplifying it down to 2 lanes, there's more cards available to interact with. Because if you think you have 10 cards, if you play 6 cards in a round, they're split into 2, 2, and 2 in a 3-row game. If you play a card as my opponent into any one of those rows to impact them, you're only impacting 2 of my cards.
Yeah.
But in a 2-row system, that could be a 3-3 or a 4-2, and suddenly your choices of which row to impact is more impactful for your game.
That makes sense, and the balance between playing between rows makes more importance.
And I'm sure the game balance as well comes a lot easier when you just got to balance a ranged and a front line.
I think the one thing I did enjoy, because I believe in the original, which one you can correct me, is that units had specific, like this was a siege unit only. It couldn't be played in any other row.
It had a designated row, and that was all it could be played in.
So that was the frustrating part of the old game that they corrected with this new version, where any card can play into any row. However, it usually has a better effect if it's played within a certain
And some
row.
of them have dual abilities, though.
Yes.
And they're completely different, too. Like, it's not like you play this guy, deal 2 damage. Oh, you play it in range, deal 2 damage. No, it's usually a completely
So as a first time jumping recently again back into it, I picked the Monster Starter deck. The Monster Starter deck has a consume ability, which you consume units that you previously used to buff your current.
Mm-hmm.
So if you played a 4 in the previous rounds, you can swallow that 4, and now this one creature that was worth 1 is now worth 5. He gets the +4. There's units, like you said, the dual ability where if I play it in the melee, I can consume my own unit. Or if I play it in the ranged, I can suddenly consume one of my opponent's units. You don't get any of the bonus benefits of consuming other than just the score.
It's just a KO, yeah.
But if he had played something that was really big in the previous rounds to win that round, I can suddenly now stack that into my deck and get benefit through that. So the dual class units were very interesting on that. The monster decks seemed to suit pretty well with my play style, which was interesting. So they did a pretty good job of giving me a description of what I would be playing.
Mm-hmm.
Had a lot of that interaction within my own graveyard, which was cool.
Yeah.
So any last couple thoughts on either the gameplay side for you or from a designer's perspective? Anything you enjoyed from it? We didn't really touch too much on the designer, but...
Yeah, well, I mean, we kind of did, just in the aspect of playing a game that has a win condition that isn't based on making your opponent lose.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there is times where you're tied into making your opponent score less than you, but your goal is to score more than them
at all times. Yeah.
And there are more games coming out now that kind of play into that positive reinforcement action of I want to score more than my opponents, not I want to survive longer than my opponents and make sure that they go down to nothing.
Yeah.
From a design perspective on that sense, that's just a very positive way to interact with your players because it always feels like they are accomplishing something. And when you're winning in that event, you feel good because you're gaining points. And your opponent feels good because they have the ability to gain points.
Mm-hmm.
Or if you turn that into the inverse head of when you are losing HP in a game, you feel that sense of pressure and that sense of snowball of, oh, there's nothing I can do. There's no way I can come back. My opponent's out-pressuring me.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's a steady slope downwards in those games usually.
Yeah, we've always talked about that in a lot of our games because a lot of our games are so combat-driven that we typically have always gone for the HP system. Yeah. It's the standard system for most design games of combat. But when we went to Gen Con a few years ago and we did our playtesting, we had a couple people that it was interesting showed up and they were like, oh, thought this would be a different type of game. That's fine. We're going to play it. I typically don't play games that I attack my opponent because I feel mean. So I play passive was one of the, and over the years, not particularly with that game, but with future games that we looked at, we started looking at different ways of scoring.
Well, even in that game, our most recent update to it has changed it to a scoring system where you're trying to collect resource to win as opposed to reduce your opponent's resource.
That was very recently changed, but because it was easier to balance too.
And our other main game that we've been working on for a while, we also changed that from a HP reduction system to a gaining victory point system.
Mm-hmm. And it just made it feel like for people who are more of a passive playstyle, it's more of an encouragement to play.
But it also allows us to create better balance options within the games so you can play with, if the person is winning, you get bonuses for playing against them, whereas before it was the person losing that gained advantages, and it was a weird balance of, when do I want to win, when do I want to lose? But it's a very interesting design mechanic to play around with the idea of positive scoring as opposed to negative scoring.
And another thing that I'm usually a huge fan of in games is when you can avoid any sort of random mana. So Gwent, again, is a non-resource based.
A very important thing to
So for me, that's a huge positive because I tend to really enjoy those games that take away that, like, there's always RNG in card games. I get that, and that's a huge factor of the game. But the worst feeling of a Magic player, and any Magic player will agree to me, is getting mana screwed or mana dried and not having what you need. Having the cards in your hand to win the game, and then just hoping every single draw for the next 6 turns is a resource and you don't get 1 mana or you don't get the right mana. And nothing is more frustrating in a game than that feeling. It feels like my deck could have won, but I didn't. Where these games really avoid that whole system of, oh, I had bad draws. Well, yeah, sure, you're going to have bad draws, but it's not like, oh, I could have won. It was either he beat me based on his deck and based on the RNG he had, and I, who was standing a decent chance, just didn't quite be able to beat his combo.
And in this game, with most people, as you said, 25 card deck is your minimum, but most people will stick to that because that means your ability to draw your potent cards is much higher. So in that first round, if you draw 10 cards, suddenly the next cards that you draw come from a pool of 15, and you know what your 15 cards are. So you can kind of play towards, okay, if I manage to pull one of these in the next 2 rounds, that'll set up my hand great for a final push.
Yeah, and there's cards too that pull cards from your deck to even thin them out, the dominance summoning and stuff like that.
And for deck building as well, we have to kind of touch on it. It's very similar to other games where there's quantities of cards available to put into a deck based on their strength or rarity system within the game. Mm-hmm. So obviously your most strong cards, you're only allowed to have 1 of them, but some generic cards are extremely powerful and you could have 2 or 3 of them in your deck at 25.
Yeah.
So again, that comes into the idea of just being able to thin out your deck with consistency. And you don't get those 3 cards that you put into the deck in your first 10. Yeah. Suddenly you have a 3 in 15 chance to pull them later on, and that's pretty good odds in a card game.
Yeah, the fact of this game being, it is really about the management of the hand and the ability to tell what you might be pulling and when you need it. Yeah. It does really, it's an RNG based system still, but it isn't so random that you feel like, oh, I got screwed because of lack of draw. No, usually if you get beat, you feel like you got beat because they had a better deck or they played it better.
Yeah, for me, it's always that the opponent played it better, or they did something that forced an extremely positive hand reaction from me for them. Yeah. Where they did a play and my reaction was, I quit now and I'm behind, or I have to play 3 cards to counter what just happened and then I'm behind for the rest of the game.
Yeah. And I really enjoy that system, and a lot of times my games would go, I would be sitting at the first round would be, I sit at 30 points, which is a pretty decent size. Good round, yeah. It's a good round, and I'd sit at 30 points, and I know I haven't played my best cards, but because of the combos I played, I've maximized my possibility, and the person's like, okay, I'm at 12, I'll pass. Yeah. Give me the first round. Well, I now know going into the second round, my hand, I have 50 points in my hand still, even though I'm less cards, but I didn't have to show my true potential. And that feels really good to then slap a 50-pointer after hitting a 30, and they're like, oh, you had more. I should have continued to make you bluff and continue to play.
And one of the fun things about the game also is in that first round when both people just go absolutely balls to the wall, and they score 55 to 52 in a victory. Mm-hmm. And the next rounds are 7-5 and 4-2, and someone wins the game. It's sometimes the swings like that are just so intense. They're just like, oh, I won the game by 2 points, but only scored 4. Yes.
So I definitely think that the overall feeling is great with that, and I like the non-resource system. I really wanted to touch on that from the design, because that's one of my favorite design aspects of a game, is when a game can get away. It's not a combat-based game.
And not just non-resource. Even if there's extremely minor resource involvement, I'd group them together. Yeah. We haven't talked about Epic, the card game. White Wizard Games.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah.
But that's another game.
Think about it. Minimal resource.
Where there's only a 0 and a 1 for resource. Might be a 2 also.
Yeah, there's not. It doesn't go high.
The resource is so minimal in that game that it's also another added element of more so thinking about when to play cards, not playing your best
random.
card. Yes.
It's not random. The non-random resource system is what I should probably group it into. I like the structured resource where it's either no resource or structured, like the last episode with Mage Noir. Even though there's 6 possible colors, it isn't random. It's structured, and you plan.
There's always a way to get planned resource. It's never a luck element.
And that feels good. And with lots of popular games, like Digimon that just came out, it also doesn't use that. A lot of games
are shifting away from that randomness, because if everyone who's played Magic says the worst part about Magic is the randomness
resource system.
And I think it's funny that games like Pokemon TCG, where they also kind of have a mana system that's random with their energy system. And like that's a popular game as well, but it suffers from the same, oh, if I don't get energy, I'm screwed.
Yeah.
I mean, they solve it really well by just like pumping abilities and trainer cards into that game where you can draw energy cards like it's nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure Magic has decks where you can just pump out mana like it's absolutely nothing. But by avoiding that altogether, it creates other options for players that is a positive reaction.
Yeah, and as new games, Magic can do it because Magic has the lifeblood of everyone, that they can get away with continuing to do that system because it works and it's good.
And Pokemon gets away with it because they've been around for so long, and Pokemon is such a strong IP that so many people are happy resonating with and playing.
And they're good games, and the system works. I should really touch on that. The system works. The hardest part is getting new players introduced to a system that hurts. Old players love it, and they get used to it.
Pokemon has a easier time doing that because it's Pokemon.
Yes.
You can show it to a 5-year-old kid and they start clapping their hands. They don't even care what's going on. They'll slap cards on the table and have fun.
Hell, I never even played the Pokemon TCG growing up. I just collected the cards and would run around and do battles with the cards. So
and that Magic suffers because of that, because they do have the perceived notion of being for an older, cooler geek audience, as I put up my air quotes for that.
But we'll jump back into this. We'll go right back into our rubric after we got on our little tangent. But its design aspect is we like to really go into that of how this game, you know, where it differs a lot and where we enjoy the differential. But we'll see if that, you know, moves over into the rubric side. So we'll jump right into our impression category. But the rubric is a score out of 50. Most of these rankings are out of 5, other than 2. We just rated those ones slightly higher. So we figured because they grasp such a large grouping, we'd give them a higher scoring to.
And they're also just much more important to us because if these 2 categories score strongly, it kind of trumps the rest of the categories' importance. Yes. A game could look bad, be difficult to learn, have terrible design and stick figures for art. But if the gameplay is really good,
it's still going to score high.
And you continually want to play it, it's a good game.
Yeah, I agree. So jumping into our impression category, we have theme, rules, design and art, and complexity. All score out of 5. We'll kind of take it back and forth on this. Brendan, I will let you start with theme. Where do you have it scored at?
So again, this is borderline generic fantasy for me. This is a 4, as usual for me. I know that this builds off of the Witcher world, and after playing the Witcher game and how expansive that world was and how great that was, I just never personally cared too much about the lore and the story going on in Witcher. Like, to me, like, a 4 is still a solid number. It's my generic fantasy number. But it wasn't a world that had me encaptured, and I wanted to be part of this, and I wanted to play the cards because of the story behind the cards. And so it's a 4.
So for me, going on that same idea, it is generic fantasy. It's based off of a huge game with huge lore. There's books, there's TV shows out now.
Yeah.
Fantastic Netflix adaptation, and the games themselves have been super popular. So it has this huge IP behind it. But I still felt like the theme for this game fell flat compared to what it could have pulled from for me. So because, yes, generic fantasy is typically right at that 4, but I think because it had such a availability to pull and it fell flat on the theme for me.
And I want to touch on that as well, as you talked about it being such a gigantic IP. Its IP is built off of good gameplay, though.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like we talked about before, Pokemon, Digimon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Magic, where these IPs are known for their worlds, their characters. To me, The Witcher is known for its excellent gameplay within the world they've created.
And the story behind it.
So it makes it a little bit harder to put lore and involvement into these cards because the characters were designed for the game. Well, the game wasn't designed for the characters.
Yeah, and for me, that's where it's like, okay, this is generic fantasy, but because of what the strong feelings and everything that it has, I expected more from it. So I have to almost bring it down a bit because even though it's generic fantasy, it fell a little bit more flat than I expect for generic.
You thought it should be a little bit stronger because of the IP.
Yeah, so for me, it's a 3. Yeah, it's generic fantasy, but because it had such an IP and it still fell flat to me, I'm like, I have to lower it in a way. For at least the theme wise. Jumping into the rules portion of this game, again, we talked about how this game, you play the cards, there's no mana. For me, I had a bad experience. Again, this is going to fall into the same idea as the was it Monster Hunter when I played it on the Game Boy? Monster Rancher.
Yes.
I had a bad experience with learning rules on it that left me a little sour taste in my mouth. Same here. I'm going to rate it at a 4, which isn't bad by any means. It is a very simple game, though. It should have been a 5. The reason being, when I play on the mobile version and I was looking at a card and it would say like this ability. Okay, what does this ability do? Oh, I think it does this, but it wouldn't trigger right. And I'm like, I don't know. It's not explaining to me. And it would show this little picture of a finger with like rings around it. And I'm like, okay, so I'm sitting there tapping on the card icon, trying to get it to expand the rules.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I hold it for a little bit. Nope. Tapping it. No. I'm like, what the hell? So I spent like 4 games just playing cards until I figured out the abilities. And finally another one came up where I didn't know what it was. And I'm like, okay, I've tried everything. So I sat there and held my finger on it for like 3 seconds. And eventually it expanded and showed me all the details of what it is. And I'm like, oh, great. I wish there would have been, and that was in the tutorial, might you?
Yeah.
Wish it would have been clearer to say, press and hold for full explanation of cards. Because the game is very simple, but it didn't do that for me, so I left salty taste in my mouth. So 4.
And I put it as 5 just because of how simple it is. I remember jumping into this game for the first time, and it was like the rules are simple. The depth and complexity of playing the game correctly is a whole other level, which is great. You want the entry level to get in to learn the game to be simple.
You play the cards in the rows.
And it's unfortunate that your experience is on the mobile version where the cards are shrunk and everything has to be popping up like that, because on the PC version, it's really easy to see cards. And the moment you hover over them, the cards can pop up bigger and they tell you what they do. So
yeah, and even going into the original Witcher, it was very clear what the things did. So it was just that experience on the mobile that kind of brought it down.
That's all right.
And that happens, and that's part of the experience and learning. So jumping into the design and art of it, which is a little bit more, art is, I guess, kind of more on the gamer side, and the design of the actual card is a little bit more on our developer forte. So where do you have opinions on the design and art?
I have a 4 on the design and art. And the only reason it is a 4 and not a 3 is because the actual art pieces themselves in the game are extremely strong. Otherwise, like, to me, the design of the cards is lackluster. It's just kind of neutral. It exists within the game. Because of the way the game is played with the multiple lanes, the images are shrunk down to certain sizes. So you don't really get much out of it. I mean, if you took everything aside and just said, rate these art pieces, and you looked at the game, they'd be extremely high quality, 4 or 5 out of 5.
The huge design company behind it, so that you would hope that they're doing a good job on it,
But just the way the actual game feels and the cards look, I gave it a 4.
Yeah, for me, it's a 3. I think if this would have been an indie company coming out with it, I would have to give it a little bit more of a favor. But because it is a big company with lots of money, and the idea of when I'm really trying to think of this, I try to think of these digital card games as best as I can, is how could I see this adapted into real board games? And
these games you can't.
You can't. So in that way, I have to give them a little bit of a step back, because they're so reliant on all these digital animations, and these cards have all these abilities that if you tried to reduplicate
and that part of the design is because they can get away with it on a computer platform, because they have to format it in a certain way to get away with it.
Because I'm such a tabletop favor, and I love playing digital games, but I like also trying to think of them as if they could ever be. Like, you know, we'll talk about Hearthstone eventually, and I feel like that game could. There's RNG elements from it, but this game would be very difficult for me to see it remade into a tabletop version successfully.
And the only reason that I think it couldn't is because the tracking of the scores every round would be a nuisance. You play something, you get up to 27, your opponent does a -6 +6, and you're -6, and the next turn you're doing +8. Someone is going to mess up in there, and it's impossible to go back and track exactly what happened perfectly to make sure your score is
that
correct.
makes sense too, but for design, for me, when I look at it, these cards are plain and simple, but that's only because they can do everything on the background. All these abilities can be shoved somewhere else that you never have to see it.
If it was an actual card, the image would probably be tiny, full of text.
So for that, right away, it brings the design down. The art, like you said, is beautiful, so I smacked it down in the middle. It's a 3, right in the middle, because of those aspects of, if they had to try to incorporate all that text into the card, the design just wouldn't work.
Yeah.
It's a digital only design. So I have to give it kind of a lower score for that. Jumping into complexity of the game, I can let you start.
I hit it right out of a 5. I thought the game was exactly where I wanted it to be. It was as strategically difficult as you wanted it to be, or it could be as strategically simple as you wanted it to be. And the more you get familiar with the game, the more comfortable you get with playing at that higher level. Complexity is never an issue. You're never thinking, oh, this game is too hard. The hard part of the game is making the good choices at the right time.
Yeah, and in my experience, so it's a 4 for me. My experience was I found the game too easy. And maybe it's because I didn't either. It's just not as popular, and there's not as many good players out there. Or again, like I just didn't get to that high enough ranking
to get to that point.
So for me, especially at the beginning, I remember it being a little bit better when I started playing.
I remember when I started as well. It's very disappointing at the beginning, coming from a card game player background, because you understand these concepts better than others and can see the potential and combos better than others. So you're able to play these, and your opponents just seem to be playing random cards. It almost feels like a bot, as you were saying.
So for me, it just was a little bit more shorter than even what I remember originally playing it, maybe because I dedicated, or I was at the start of it more, so there was more people playing and at higher skill levels, even though they were ranked lower. Mm-hmm. So, coming back into it, I definitely felt like, man, this is too easy. So it's a 4. I definitely remember it being more difficult and more like satisfaction from that difficulty than what I remembered playing recently. So it just balanced it out. 4 is still a good score, like we say, but just doesn't quite hit that 5 for me.
Yeah.
That's kind of the impression category. So we can jump into our game category, where we talk about gameplay, which we had mentioned is one of our categories that we rate out of 10, because gameplay is such a broad stroke. It covers so many different things within it, and it can swing a game regardless of how crappy the art or design is.
It can cover a lot of flaws in the game if the gameplay is solid.
So we figured we should rate it a little bit higher than normal. And then also in that gameplay category, we talk about the depth of the game, the possibility of combos, what we can see, what the potential future is
the amount of strategic choices. Lots of elements go into depth as well.
So depth is only out of 5. Gameplay is out of 10. Jumping right into gameplay, I ranked it out of 7. I have it as a 7 for the reason being that I enjoyed the game. I remember enjoying the game a lot more when I put more time into it when I first started playing it a few years ago when it first came out. Jumping back into it again for a refresher, I didn't enjoy it nearly as much. And I don't know if it was just my experience with it or how I was just done with it from previously playing it. So it was out of 7. The gameplay is very good. It's a good game. I never felt like it was like, oh, why am I even bothering with this? But I just couldn't quite sink my teeth fully into the gameplay. So it just kind of sits at a 7 for me.
Okay. And for me, I have it as a 9. I thoroughly enjoyed this style of game. I would love for this to exist in a tabletop form, even though it'll probably never happen because of the complexities of tracking. And we both know the downfalls of having too many things that you need to track at once. And once you lose track of one, you lose track of them all.
Yeah.
It's also a 9 because I enjoy how strong the strategic element to this game is once you get to a point where you're facing people who also are playing at that strategic level. Mm-hmm. It's no longer, as you said, card luck, drawing resource, hoping that you can execute your plan. It's you have your cards, figure out your plan, execute it the best you can. Mm-hmm. If your opponent has a better setup at the beginning and then they do a better execution of it, that's just the name of the game, and that's fine.
Yeah, and a lot of the times with these games, because we're at a similar skill level, these are the type of games that I would really like to see on a tabletop so I could play you, because maybe my experience would be different playing at somebody at the same level as me, but playing with randoms, like I said, it was a very bot feeling to me, which sometimes is great at the intro, but I just was ready for more right away.
Yep.
So 7, 9 for you. That's a decent score.
Yep.
Jumping into the depth of the game. 4 for me.
Yep.
Game is decently complex with the choices that you have to make, but a lot of the times if something goes wrong or something happens, you just don't have options and you need to pass and go to the next round.
Yep.
That in itself is a choice though, so I definitely think it deserves its 4.
Yep. And I give it a 4. Very similar reasons. I also I give it a 4 because eventually you do get to a point where there are optimal deck choices. And sometimes it comes down to that first 10 card draw. You can face a lot of similar matchups, a lot of mirror matchups. If your opponent gets like one of these 3 cards and you don't, and they show it on their first play, you instantly go, okay, well, I've lost this round, do I lose the game? Like there's some of that going on, but if at the core of the gameplay experience itself, if you ignore mirror matchups, if it was just you and a buddy playing a game, there's lots of depth. There's lots of options to build decks. There's lots of options within the game itself to make decisions that will impact your play. But it's not quite good enough for me to be a 5. Also have to give a slight knock down from the 5 to a 4 because it is a collectible card game in a digital format. So a lot of the time, you're not going to get a chance to experience the true depth of the game because the good cards are being constantly changed, constantly balanced, or are just not accessible for the average player.
Yeah. If you're not just if playing it casually, you might not experience
Casual players will never experience the true gameplay experience that you get out of this.
Yeah.
Because you really need to invest time into getting those cards.
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's like, that's the common digital CCG. And honestly, a lot of the times in any CCG.
That's true.
But more specifically there, because you can't just go out and buy said cards.
Yes, in physical format, you go to a local card shop, you pretty much get whatever you want if you got the money for it.
Yeah.
In digital format, you can spend thousands of dollars on booster packs and only get some cards that you don't need, and then you can break them down into resource and usually use that resource to buy other cards.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a lot of investment needed if you don't hit that luck.
Yeah. And that's fine. Sometimes you get lucky too on one pack and you get that card. So It's all balances out in the end. Jumping into our post-play category where we have replayability and cost satisfaction. Replayability being another one of those 10 for us out of 10 because we think it's really important. It can balance out a game if it was fun and you want to play it again. And you
How can you ever recommend a game that you never want to play again?
Yeah.
Even if you had the greatest experience of it.
So it should knock the score down overall if it was bad, or if you really enjoyed it, it needs to be higher. So that's out of 10. We also have cost satisfaction, which is out of 5, which is how satisfied are we or would we be with the purchase of this game based on its price. For these type of games, we also take in consideration the availability of how to get the cards and how much money you'd have to spend to be competitive or want to do there. So we'll look at that as well. But starting off, B, replayability for you. Out of 10, what did you rank it?
5. And that may seem a bit low based on how I enjoyed the gameplay and how much I talk up this game saying it's such a positive experience to me. But like this game and other digital card games, I find that once you are done with it, picking it back up is not the greatest experience. You go in, there's so much has changed. The whatever investment you had put into the game previously no longer really has much relevant to the game. Mm-hmm. And usually the experience of coming back to a game like this and playing it again isn't strong enough to make me want to stick around and continue to play it. Like, this is a game that I am very happy I played. I enjoyed when I played it. It has influenced some of my design choices and the way I view things in games. But I don't need to go back and play it again.
And for all the exact same reasons, I have it at a 5 as well. Identical.
Okay.
They're identical because honestly, like I had even said in this review, when I jumped back into it, I had remembered it being better than what I have replayed. And it just shows me that I obviously enjoyed it more the first time playing.
And I wouldn't say that the game is better or worse. It's just, it's so difficult to jump back into a card game when there are 400 cards available, and after years of not playing, I come back in and I only have access to a 40 card pool, which is the same experience a new player will get. Mm-hmm. And it's even more frustrating for me as a person who did play it quite a bit and had access to a couple cards that I had nothing anymore, which makes sense. I didn't play in so long, but that hurts the replayability for me because it's such a grind.
Yeah. Nope. So we'll talk that a bit. Cost satisfaction, again, it's out of 5. I'll start with this. It's a 4.
Yep.
It's a free-to-play game.
Yep.
So that almost should be a default to a 5, but like a lot of these games, because it went the option of a free-to-play CCG, to really get into those high level of plays, to really get into those min-maxing decks, you are going to have to start dropping money. And once you start dropping money on a game like
unless
this,
you're extremely patient and are willing to grind for years just to maybe get one top deck.
Which there's some people that will do that. But for those people that want the instant competitiveness of a game, which I don't think this game necessarily needs. I think there's a lot for a new player to start to work their way up to something, but eventually you're going to get this point where you have to make the decision to stop playing or start investing. Yeah. And that is where the cost satisfaction falls off for me, because as soon as that happens, and that had happened to me, I had played, got to that point where I need to now either make the decision of I need to stop playing because I've done as much as I feel like I'll enjoy, or I need to start spending money to start being competitive.
The problem is when you start playing that, you start saying, oh, this super rare card will be a great option for my deck. Oh, that might cost me like $42 to get a chance to make that card. Okay, let's see if there's any other cheaper decks. No, there's not. Yeah. So that's where it drops. It drops to a 4. It's a free-to-play game that has a lot of early potential, but eventually hits that wall of do I want to spend money or not? And for me, the value just wasn't there by the time I got there. Yeah. So, and I went even lower. I went to a cost satisfaction of a 3. Yes, it's a free-to-play model, but the game you get at a free-to-play model is different than the game you actually get later on. And the big reason why I have it as a 3 is because TCG fashion, I spend all my money, boom, I feel 5, I feel great, I got all the cards I want. Years later, boom, it's a 1. Terrible investment choice. Yeah. So it's got to be a 3 for me.
It's that instant gratification of while you're playing the game, and then in the long term, you no longer get
But that 5 of instant gratification in the game can also drop to a 1 immediately if you do not get anything good from your pulls.
Yeah.
So that's why I kind of balance it out as a 3. It can be good, it can be bad. It's about where you would expect for a TCG, CCG type of game.
I feel like these digital ones are a little bit more feel bad than the traditional style.
Yes, because at least you have a physical card when you purchase it.
And those decks can be relevant. The cards can be relevant.
Yes.
Where in these, because the seasons flood, you're not playing. Well, I guess there are
the
legacy
big thing as well is like
fashions,
for physical card games, there's always a resale factor, even if your cards are worth a penny. Yeah. At least you own that penny. In a digital format, you never earn any of these cards. You can spend $600 on this game and get great cards. But then what? When the game's done, it's done. If the game shuts down, the developer stops supporting it, your $600 is sunk. You don't had a chance to go onto eBay and sell all your cards for $100 and make a bit of money back.
Yeah. So, jumping into our final score of the rubric, Brendan, what did you score Gwent, the Witcher card game?
39 out of 50.
And I scored it a 34 out of 50.
Okay.
Still a fairly good score, even though we, ragged on it in a few spots and really praised it in some other ones. It did seem to balance into a, above that halfway mark.
Yeah. And I'd say it's an above average game, so it's pretty much where it should be hitting.
Accurate score. But my main question for you, B, is this a cash or trash game for you?
This one was a bit of a difficult one for me to determine because there are two different sides of this game. If you like strategy card games and are okay with investing time and a little bit of money, yeah, this game's probably cash for you. But if you're looking at just trying to get an education in card games and to try things out, you can get a full understanding of this game because we talked about the simple rules by watching one match of 15 minutes on YouTube and seeing what people do and saying, oh, okay, that's a cool idea. He had 10 cards. He played 6 of them. He passed his round. His opponent decided to play their entire hand to win the round, and you can see the hand management system there. But aside from that, like it's honestly trash if you have no intention to get involved in the game.
Yeah. If you're not a fan, so for me, this game is a trash, kind of with the caveat.
As a gamer,
I think this game, it's hard to say. So as a personal level, this game is trash just because I did not enjoy it as much with the non-competitiveness of actual fight. At the same time, I see so much potential of what this game is, and there's a lot of people who do not like the combat-based system, and they would prefer the strategy-based.
That's more of a designer aspect you're looking at there. Is there value from people trying to get an education on card games to playing this game? Yes, there is absolutely value in this game to learn, to be brought from, to possibly adapt into your own game designs.
Yeah.
But on a general level, you have to say this game is not worth it for an average person saying, hey, I want to play a new game. What game should I pick up? I would not recommend.
Yeah, it's hard to say. If you're the type of player that enjoys non-combative games where you're kind of just playing, I do think it's a good recommendation.
If this was a physical format game,
it would
score better, it'd be easier to recommend, and the player base would be a lot more accessible, I think, for the ones that are looking for the non-competitive card games.
I think for my personal take, it was a little boring from my side. A little too easy for an experienced gamer. It might be better for intro, but honestly, there's a lot of better games out there that you could be playing.
Absolutely.
So I do think that I'm going to have to stand by my trash and just say this isn't really worth your time to play it. Yeah. There's a lot of better games out there. If you're curious about it, I don't think it's a bad thing. I just don't think it's going to be...
I have it rated as... I circled it as cash initially because of the value you can get from playing it when you're trying to learn and see what kind of design choices they made. Like, there's a lot of good design choices that were made that players get an option to play within the game.
And I'd love to see somebody try to create a very similar game on the tabletop. I mean, we've been trying for years, but there's other people out there too that can create something. And I do think in a tabletop format, in a one-on-one setting, in a non-virtual world, this game would be that much more successful if they could find a simpler way to do it on the table.
I agree.
So, yeah, I guess I'll sit by my trash.
I'll sit in the middle. Yeah, I'll sit in the middle of that.
But yeah, okay. Tune in next time.
Tune in next time. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for tuning in to the DWMC podcast, a Paragon Professional Services production. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you have any comments or concerns about what you have heard, send us an email, contact@paragonstudiosmb.com. If you haven't already done so, please consider subscribing to the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you consume your podcasts, and leave a comment with a 5-star review if you feel so inclined. For those of you watching on YouTube, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment below.